Hi, everyone, and welcome to California Transportation 101, a comprehensive overview of how transportation works in California. How California funds and approves our transportation and housing projects shapes daily life for millions of people. Our ability to get around freely defines our access to opportunities like jobs, school, healthcare, and everyday needs. California has the largest and most complex transportation system of any state. It encompasses a massive highway system, of course, also multiple large urban transit systems. We're building a significant rail investment, and we've got multiple ports. Many agencies are involved in making decisions, in managing funding, and in our very complicated planning processes. This Transportation 101 series is designed to give you an overview of how things work and get you on your feet so that you and your organization can impact what we're investing in and building with better outcomes for Californians. This video covers the first part of 6 topics. All right, let's get started. This work has been sponsored and funded by NRDC, so I'm going to start by thanking them for supporting this work and ensuring that we can all have a better understanding of this complicated landscape. I want to introduce myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Jeanie Ward-Waller. I am the Director of Transportation Advocacy at Fearless Advocacy, which is a lobbying firm here in Sacramento. Prior to my time at Fearless, I was at Caltrans for 6 years and worked as both the Sustainability Program Manager as well as the Deputy Director overseeing the planning and multimodal programs. I've been an advocate in Sacramento for over a decade and worked for several nonprofit organizations before my time at Caltrans and started my career as an engineer. So I bring that training and expertise and background to this work. All right, as I said, this Transportation 101 series is a 6-part series. I'm going to cover some of the important aspects of our transportation system. First, I'll just talk about the basic components of the system and the different modes. I'll also talk about the agencies who make decisions at different levels. I'm going to talk about how projects are funded and our major funding sources and programs. Talk about the complicated planning processes that we have in the state, as well as the policies that guide our transportation investments. And finally, the last part, I'm going to highlight some near-term opportunities for advocates as we start 2026. All right, so this is part 1, and you're going to learn about the components, the different modes and ways that we move people and goods around the state, as well as I'll highlight some tools that help us understand impacts to communities from our transportation system. So these are the major modes that I'm going to talk about. So first, of course, driving provides the greatest access to our state, given the extensive road and highway network we have. Walking and bicycling is the next mode I'll talk about since it primarily happens on our road system. And I'm going to specifically highlight how our active transportation infrastructure is working and some ways that it's not working well for us. I'll talk about our rail system and the major investments that the state is making in rail, particularly high-speed rail. I'll talk about public transit and how we actually have extensive public transit in all communities of all sizes in our state. But unfortunately, this service doesn't work well for folks because of the lack of frequency and convenience. Finally, I'll talk about the major components of our freight system. And I'll finish this section talking about some of those impacts, the tools we can use to understand impacts to communities. All right, so jumping in, this map that you see on the right shows that extensive system of roads and highways. You can see our state highway and interstates crisscross the state, and you can really get nearly anywhere in a car in the state of California. Both the state and local roads encompass about 400,000 lane miles of pavement in the state. And about 1/8 or 52,000 lane miles of that is the state highway system, which Caltrans is responsible for managing. Importantly, it's worth understanding that almost 60% of the driving miles or vehicle miles traveled in the state happens on that state highway system, even though it's a smaller component of our overall road system. And because of that, nearly 60% of federal funds that come to California as formula dollars to maintain our system is used on the state highway system because there's so much greater use on that system. And also, I think really it's important for us as advocates to understand that even though we have so much roadway and significantly in our urban areas, we really have very large and I would argue overbuilt roads. You can see a couple of images on this slide of how more car infrastructure is not necessarily serving us well. And what we see and what we know from many decades of research, really back to the beginning of when we started building roads and driving, is that more and bigger roadways in urban areas actually worsen congestion because they induce driving. In terms of active transportation, which is the term we use for walking and bicycling, there's really quite a bit less access because the infrastructure for specifically for walking and biking is not as extensive on our roadways. And I'm just showing you a snapshot here. This is only referencing the infrastructure such as sidewalks and bike lanes that we have on the state highway system. So this doesn't encompass local streets. But what I'm showing and what this is an example of is that I'll explain the bar chart. So that top bar shows what is existing today on our state highway system. And what you see is that roughly a third of the state highway system is freeway. So that's, those are the facilities that you are not allowed to walk or bike on. They're very high speed. They are limited access facilities. The rest of the state highway system is non-freeway. So though that component of the state highway system is accessible for walking and bicycling. However, only 3% of the entire state highway system has sidewalks or bike lanes. So there are only safe facilities dedicated to walking and bicycling on roughly 3% of the state highway system, which is, clearly presents a problem because this infrastructure is disconnected and these state highways are often higher speed facilities where you really need to separate out people walking and bicycling from high speed traffic. What I show in the bottom bar is what is planned for the future. And this is reflected in Caltrans active transportation plans, which they've done in all 12 districts. And you can see that Caltrans is planning to expand the sidewalks and bike lanes on the state highway system significantly so that there's at least 10% of the system covered with dedicated facilities for walking and bicycling. So we have ambitious goals to build more infrastructure for active transportation, but we really don't have very extensive networks today that keep people safe. The result of that, as many of us know in advocacy, is that the safety risks are really much more significant and really disproportionate for people walking and bicycling in our state. This little chart from the Caltrans Highway Safety Improvement Report shows how fatalities and serious injuries are rising in this time period. The data lags, so this is 2013 to 2021, but even in the more recent years, that those numbers are continuing to tick up. So even though walking and bicycling is a much smaller percentage of overall trips in our state, represents 30% of fatal crashes. Fatalities in crashes are killing people who are walking and bicycling on our roadways. And really important to note this, how this data breaks down when you look at things like income and race and ethnicity. There's a really disproportionately higher rate of people of color and low-income people that are victims of these traffic fatalities, particularly when it comes to pedestrian fatalities. All right, I'm going to shift gears and talk about our rail system. This map is showing the plans for the really extensive high-speed rail system, which will essentially be the backbone of our inner city rail in California. So the section through the Central Valley there between Merced and Bakersfield is a section that is under construction today, but it is projected to run all the way from Sacramento and San Francisco in the Bay Area down to San Diego in the future. So very ambitious goals. The state is making huge investments in high-speed rail. And in the meantime, we have 3 inner-city rail routes, which are run through a JPA with Caltrans, the San Joaquins, Capital Corridor, and the Surfliner. We also have a number of commuter and heavy rail systems, as well as regional light rail systems in our urban regions of the state. So I describe our rail system in California as a big vision, but today really you can only get between our major cities with limited options in terms of frequency. Public transit, on the other hand, which primarily, is buses in our state, can get you almost anywhere in the state. And this is a map from the state's open data portal showing all of the transit routes in the entire state. It's zoomed out, so it looks, pretty hard to, see the detail in our urban regions, but you can see that there is transit nearly everywhere in the state. In fact, the number is 11,633 specific transit routes across the state. And these are managed by literally hundreds of public transit operators. So part of the challenge here is just how disaggregated the system is because there are so many players. And that covers, as I mentioned, fixed route buses, light rail, which we talked about, paratransit, dial-a-ride or on-demand service, as well as ferry, and even, we're starting to think about bike share in this category as public transit as well. So zooming in on a couple of the big urban regions, you can see, again, there's really good coverage in terms of where transit will get you in the state, but there are many operators in these areas. So the service is really disaggregated when you're trying to get from one end of the region to another, or across cities, or across agency jurisdictions, because there's really not great coordination between agencies. The Bay Area, I think, has about 30 transit agencies serving all of those different routes. And then in rural areas, again, there's pretty good service. The service can get you even around our rural regions, and I'm just showing 2 here. But just as an example, there is pretty, the service coverage is pretty good, but of course the issue is the frequency of service. And there may, on some of these routes, only be 1 bus a day, 2 buses a day, which is much harder if you're trying to get back and forth to appointments and do other things in your day. Last but not least is our some of the major components of our freight and goods movement system. So here on this map, which is taken from the California Freight Mobility Plan, I'm specifically highlighting our ports, the seaports, as well as the land ports of entry along the Mexico border. The major ones are listed there: LA and Long Beach, Oakland, San Diego, as well as the major border crossings for freight are Otay Mesa and San Isidro. These maps, again, from the California Freight Mobility Plan, show where goods are moving to from those ports that I showed on the last slide. So the slide on the left, or the map on the left, is showing you the Southern California or SCAG region. And all those little blue dots are warehouse hubs. So you can see the concentration of warehousing both in LA, coming out of the LA and Long Beach ports, and then also kind of moving out to the inland region in San Bernardino and Riverside counties. There's some real concentration of warehouses. And then in the bigger map on the right, you can see how those warehouse hubs extend even up in the Bay Area, along the Central Valley as well, in the State Route 99 corridor, and even up into Sacramento. So you can imagine, goods are moving from all of those ports up to these warehouse hubs and creating a lot of impacts from trucking and rail and the movement of goods around our state. And as a result, I'm going to show you a couple of tools here that show the impacts from our transportation system, and really the greatest impacts in terms of public health and environmental health and air quality are coming from that goods movement system. So you can think about that map of the SCAG region that I just showed you on the last slide, and then you can see the result of that here on this slide, which is this is a map of CalEnviroScreen, the CalEnviroScreen 4.0 tool, which is showing you the overlay of all of the different environmental and health indicators that EnviroScreen measures, overlaid, and the same areas where there are those goods movement and warehouse hubs are areas where there are really significant health and environmental impacts. So I'm just showing you these snapshots as examples. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail talking about these tools, but I want to make sure that advocates are aware of the tools that are available to us to show how our transportation system is impacting communities. You can't necessarily use these to analyze a project, but what this does show you is the baseline conditions in our communities today that you can then use to understand how they may be further impacted or impacted differently or benefited by future transportation investments. So the two screening tools that I want to specifically make sure you know about is CalEnviroScreen, which is the one that's shown here on this slide, and then also the Caltrans Equity Index, which I'll show on an upcoming slide. And I specifically, the transportation indicators that I think are most important for us to use are the indicator that shows diesel particulates and where they're the greatest concentration of diesel pollution, traffic impacts as well, or traffic exposure for communities, and then the lack of access to destinations that's caused by our transportation infrastructure. So this, as I said, is showing the LA region. This is the CalEnviroScreen map with all of the different indicators overlaid. And then this map is also from CalEnviroScreen, and this is just showing you the diesel particulate layer of CalEnviroScreen. I think CalEnviroScreen has 21 different indicators. This is just one of the 21, but this one is obviously very closely correlated with transportation, and again, specifically with goods movement, because trucks and heavy duty vehicles are the major source of diesel particulates. And when you look at this map, again, looking at the LA region, you can see very clearly how diesel particulates really just follow all of the freeways and major corridors that trucks are moving on in the LA basin. And this is another layer, another indicator taken from CalEnviroScreen. This is showing the traffic impact layer in CalEnviroScreen. And again, you can see the same sort of result where the major impacts from traffic on communities, which can be a range of things, noise as well as pollution from traffic. All of those things have a big impact on communities. And in Sacramento as well, of course, the traffic impacts follow the major freeways moving through the Sacramento region. And then this last example is the Caltrans Equity Index. Caltrans Equity Index is a little bit simpler. It only uses three sort of layers, so three indicators instead of the 21 that are in CalEnviroScreen. And the Transportation Equity Index also uses census blocks instead of census tracts. So they're smaller units. When you're looking at this geographically, you can see how the colors are more fine-grained, and that's because we're using smaller census blocks instead of the tracts, which are larger and encompass more greater portion of the population. And what you see here when you look at the Transportation Equity Index that Caltrans produces is that the different colors show up as the transportation-based priority populations, which are areas that light up on all three of the screens that the Equity Index uses. There's also a traffic exposure screen. There's an access to destinations screen, which is measuring how communities have access by non-driving modes, and how well they can move around in their community. And then the last is a demographic overlay, which I believe uses income, and it may just be income in terms of the demographic layer in transportation in the Caltrans Equity Index. And that is the end of part one.